I just want you to know that when we talk about war, we're really talking about peace. George W. Bush.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we'll look at some contemporary foreign policy issues facing the United States. Between 1945 and 1991, U.S. foreign policy concerns centered around the Soviet Union and the Cold War. But since the dissolution of the USSR in the early 90s, the United States' attention has been divided between a number of volatile regions. Namely, the U.S. has faced new economic threats from China, political threats from Russia, and security threats from the Islamic world. Today, we'll take a deep dive into the latter. But first, a big question. Are America's woes in the Islamic world self-inflicted? Starting in the 1970s, the epicenter of U.S. foreign policy concerns began to shift away from Europe and the Soviet Union and towards the Middle East and Central Asia. Since 2001, the Islamic world has commanded the attention of American citizens and government officials alike. Two major wars in the region and dozens of proxy conflicts have cost the United States billions of dollars and untold resources. The rise of radical Islam in various pockets throughout the Middle East has posed new threats to human rights and national security. But does the United States share in the responsibility for these threats? Or is it simply a great challenge of the 21st century? Let's take a look at the history of America's involvement in the Islamic world, then you decide. Our first big idea outlines the catalyst for much of America's recent dealings in the Middle East and Central Asia. The terror attacks of September 11, 2001 escalated American involvement in the Islamic world, most immediately in Afghanistan. On September 11, 2001, the United States suffered the deadliest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. On that day, 4 civilian airliners were hijacked and intentionally crashed. 2 of the planes were flown into the World Trade Center, whose twin towers had long defined New York City's skyline. A 3rd plane struck the Pentagon, the headquarters of America's military apparatus. The 4th plane is believed to have been headed to the U.S. Capitol building, but was downed in a Pennsylvania field after passengers on board bravely fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the attacks, which shook Americans to their core. But to really understand 9/11, as well as its aftermath, we need to revisit the 1980s conflict between the USSR and Afghanistan. You'll recall that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and attempted to establish communism there in 1979. Afghanistan quickly became a proxy arena of the Cold War, as the United States stepped in to support the Mujahideen rebels who opposed the Soviets. But the United States was not the only group to rush to the support of the Afghanis. While the United States viewed the invasion as an assault on freedom and capitalism, radical and fundamentalist Muslims in the Middle East interpreted the Soviet invasion as a war on Islam itself. The rebels thus found support from all corners of the Islamic world. Of particular note was a Saudi extremist named Osama bin Laden. In support of the Afghanis, bin Laden created an organization known as Al-Qaeda. Roughly translated, Al-Qaeda means the database. The organization acted as a logistical arm of the Afghan resistance to communism, funneling money, weapons, and fighters from the Arab world into Afghanistan. And thanks to the help they received from both the United States and Osama bin Laden, the Mujahideen forced the Soviets out of Afghanistan in 1980. But a power vacuum in the country soon led to civil war, as opposing Mujah factions wrestled for power. Ultimately, an Islamist faction known as the Taliban won control of the country, using weapons that the United States had provided. But the Taliban regime was brutal. It committed genocide against religious and ethnic minorities, and its enforcement of archaic religious law bordered on barbarism. Women lived as second-class citizens under the Taliban, and the regime denied UN food aid efforts while 160,000 of its citizens starved. Meanwhile, bin Laden transformed al-Qaeda into a terrorist organization, one that dedicated itself to waging war on Christian and Jewish interests around the world, which it viewed as a hindrance to the goal of an Islamic caliphate. Because the Taliban and al-Qaeda shared in their religious extremism, the Taliban provided refuge for bin Laden to recruit and train operatives and to plan terrorist attacks, including the September 11th attacks on the United States. Soon after the towers fell, the George W. Bush administration identified bin Laden and al-Qaeda as the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, and Congress approved military action against Afghanistan. The goal was the removal of the Taliban from power and the destruction of al-Qaeda. By December 2001, U.S. forces with support from the UK and Canada successfully drove the Taliban from power, but the war did not end. Taliban operatives fled to the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan to regroup, as did members of al-Qaeda. Progress against the Taliban and the terrorists was slow but steady for much of the following year. But the equation changed significantly in 2003, when the Bush administration shifted its attention from Afghanistan to Iraq. This is our second big idea. The United States expanded its footprint in the Islamic world with an invasion of Iraq in 2003 on the pretense that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorism. Now, ever since 1979, Iraq had been under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator of the nationalistic Ba'ath Party. Unlike the Taliban, Hussein's government was secular, not theocratic, but his human rights violations were just as egregious. Hussein oppressed the Shia Muslims of Iraq's southern and eastern region, as well as the Kurds in the north. In 1980, the United States had supported Saddam Hussein in a war against neighboring Iran. But when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait over an oil dispute in 1990, the U.S. opposed Saddam. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush led a coalition of 36 nations against Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait. This first Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm, was a resounding success, as Kuwaiti independence was restored in less than 2 months. However, with Iraqi troops expelled from Kuwait, the elder Bush decided not to invade Iraq and pursue regime change. While history has demonstrated the merit of this decision, it was at the time controversial, especially among hawkish Pentagon officials known as neoconservatives, who favored the spread of American democracy through military action. More than a decade later, many of these neoconservatives found themselves in the inner circle of the new George W. Bush administration. Most noteworthy among them were W's Vice President Dick Cheney and his Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Together, they convinced the president to pursue a course of action that his father would not: invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein's government. At the urging of the neoconservatives and the intelligence community, George W. Bush accused Saddam Hussein of having links to al-Qaeda and also of possessing weapons of mass destruction, neither of which proved to be true. But the post-9/11 anxieties over terrorism in the Middle East proved a powerful force among the American people. At the president's request, Congress voted overwhelmingly to pursue military action in Iraq, and the invasion began in March 2003. From a tactical standpoint, Operation Iraqi Freedom was a resounding success. In less than 6 weeks, U.S. forces supported by Great Britain and Australia had captured the capital of Baghdad and driven Saddam Hussein from power. The Americans installed a temporary government and made plans for nationwide elections. But the situation in Iraq quickly deteriorated. While the United States had a clear plan for invasion and succession, they were not prepared to rebuild the Iraqi economy nor its infrastructure, both of which had been devastated in the invasion. So the Iraqi people, even those who had welcomed U.S. forces months earlier, soon lost patience with the occupying American army, and an insurgency brought violence back to Iraqi streets. As early as 2004, polls indicated that Americans believed the invasion of Iraq to have been a mistake, but the toothpaste was already out of the tube. Violence in the country intensified, and the Bush administration escalated U.S. military involvement. By 2007, there were more than 170,000 U.S. soldiers in Iraq. It took years before the country was stable enough to withdraw U.S. forces. And even when that happened in 2011, the peace was not a lasting one. The effects of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are outlined in our third big idea. The global war on terror reshaped the balance of power in the Middle East and changed American notions of liberty and security. The Iraq War had far-reaching consequences. For one, it tarnished the presidency of George W. Bush. In the wake of 9/11, Bush's approval ratings approached 90%, the highest of any president in the modern era. To this day, his leadership and unifying message in the nation's most trying moments are lauded by historians and politicians across the political spectrum. But by the time he left office, the weight of the failing and unpopular Iraq War had dragged Bush's approval ratings into the low 30s. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 was as much a rejection of Bush as an endorsement of Obama's vision. Second, the toppling of Saddam Hussein, while a human rights victory in the short term, opened the door for the rise of ISIS, a radical terrorist organization that seized power in Iraq following U.S. withdrawal in 2011. Though renewed efforts by the Obama and Trump administrations eventually succeeded in recapturing territory seized by the Islamic State, the region remains volatile today. And finally, the diversion of resources to Iraq precluded victory in Afghanistan. When military resources were diverted away from Afghanistan in 2003 to support the Iraq invasion, the U.S. effectively took pressure off of the Taliban, allowing the organization to regroup and plan their own resurgence. As of 2021, the Taliban has recaptured significant territory in Afghanistan. And while Osama bin Laden was eliminated in 2011, it's widely believed that al-Qaeda remains embedded within the Taliban today. The war in Afghanistan stands as the longest-running military conflict in U.S. history, and victory is no clearer now than it was in 2003. Taken from a broader perspective, the global war on terror that began in earnest after 9/11 has cost billions of dollars, and its death toll continues to climb. Journalists and historians are still sorting through the effects of the United States' actions in the Islamic world, of which there are many. The war on terror has changed the way the United States gathers intelligence, conducts military operations, and interacts with state and non-state actors around the globe. Passed in the wake of 9/11, the USA Patriot Act expanded the government's surveillance authority, inspiring fierce debate over the relationship between security and privacy. Security at airports, sporting events, public buildings, and concert venues underwent major overhauls. In the last 2 decades, American immigration policy has generally hardened in the name of keeping terrorists out of the country. And tragically, Islamophobia and hate crimes against Muslims accelerated after 9/11 and continue to threaten the civil liberties of nearly 4 million Muslim Americans. And America's concerns in the Middle East show no sign of slowing down. In 2010 and 11, a series of revolutions across the Arab world resulted in the overthrow of dictators in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen. But in some cases, the governments who replaced them have proven sympathetic to terrorist organizations and hostile to the West. In Syria, demonstrations gave way to a complex civil war that attracted extremists from across the region. And the long Syrian civil war has served as a proxy arena for broader struggles between the United States and Russia, as well as Saudi Arabia and Iran. And speaking of Iran, that country's vacillating efforts to enrich nuclear-grade uranium have puzzled American presidents for decades. Indeed, the Islamic world poses unique challenges to Western interests, and the existence of radical ideology complicates diplomacy in more ways than we can explain here. As for America's rightful role in the region, well, that debate rages on. Some argue that if the United States abandons the Middle East, extremists will be free to recruit terrorists and plan further attacks. Others argue that our security threats are self-inflicted, and that our tendency to meddle in the region's affairs is the root cause of the anti-American sentiments among radical groups. Others still argue that regardless of the root cause, the humanitarian crises that accompany turmoil in the Islamic world demand intervention from Western powers. Perhaps the only clear answer is that there's not one. But in these situations, dominated as they are by the gray area in between, it is of paramount importance to consider the consequences of our actions and our inaction. Next time, we'll wrap things up by taking a look forward, but also taking a look back. See you then.